All right. So I'm just going to start by giving an overview of what we were looking at in the past two sessions, or should I even call it maybe 3 weeks, before we get into today's session, because what I want to do is with every session we have, I want you to understand not only where we are within the course, but I also want you to understand where that particular session fits in with everything else that we have done before. So today we are going to be looking at research, theological research. So we are going to be unpacking and defining, looking at key terms and key concepts that fall under research. But firstly, let me just go over a little bit of what we have focused on or what we've touched upon so far. So if you remember that, if you were there during the induction, so I said something along the lines of study skills is like learning a new language. So we are going to be learning an academic language. And within that language, or rather the approach that we're going to use is we're going to try and attach new terms to concepts that we already experience, things that we already lived through. And in the first session, this is where we now looked at, in lecture one, this is where we were now looking at what exactly study skills is. And so we're able to determine that studying, firstly, is a skill. And because it is a skill, we are able to perfect it by continuous practice. But most importantly, we said within the context of studying, there exists two levels or two spaces, or put differently, there are two main factors that are always at play whenever we consider studying. And we said there are internal factors as well as external factors. And among the internal factors, this is where we were focusing on you as the person that is studying. So what exactly is your attitude towards studying? What are your practices? What are your habits? How do you practically exercise study as a skill? And those were the internal, or another fancy term for internal factors, dispositional. So dispositional factors, it's actually the same thing as internal or personal factors. Then we have the external, and the term used to describe is situational. So what exactly is the situation like? So when we talk about situational factors, we are talking about things that exist within your surroundings. So this is the situation where you are studying. And we said when it comes to those external or situational factors, the issues of where you are studying, how lit is it? Is there enough light? Is it hot? Is it cold? Do you have airflow? Are you comfortable? So we in a sense, we're looking at where you like to study. And so that was our first lecture. In our second lecture, we focused on two things: plagiarism and the library. So in terms of the library, we're just looking at how do we use the library, the Mukanyo library. And we, unfortunately, for those that were online, because I attempted to take my phone with me, because that's what I was using to record. Unfortunately, it didn't work out so well, so we couldn't show you the inside of the library. But we were able to see that all of the library books that we have at our Mukanyo library are found under the 200 category. So this 200 is what is known as the Dewey Decimal System, which is a way that is used to locate books within the library. And so it starts from 000 all the way to 900. So there are 10 sections starting from the 000, which are the general books, all the way to the 900s and beyond. Well, not beyond, because it ends at 999. So each 100 numbers is going to be a completely different category or section within the library. And so books for theology and religion are found under the 200 section. So from 200 all the way to 299, that's where we are finding our books in the library. And there are also then subsections, et cetera, and you'll find out more when you open the raw guide. But in essence, when we focus on the library, that's what we're looking at. And when we looked at plagiarism, this is where we were saying plagiarism revolves around our inability to present and represent information that is coming from other people. So we made this assumption without overtly stating it. But when you are writing an assignment, or when you're doing a research report, for example, you're always going to rely on literature. And so that literature is what we were sourcing in the library. But at the same time, we're also focused on how we can ethically use the work that has been done and produced by other people. So in today's session, we are now focusing on research, where we are going to look broadly at two things. Firstly, research when it comes to writing your assignment. How do you go about it? But broadly, we are also going to be looking at research in general, but specifically within the ambit of theology. Now, what we mean by all of this, for those that might find these words too big, we are just saying, how do you conduct research? How do you look for information? How do you know that you have found the right information? How do we know that we can trust the information that we have found? So this is session 3. But ultimately, the question becomes, how does section 3 or session 3, how is it related to all of the other sessions or to study skills as a whole? Now, last week, we also spoke about how study skills, the moment we talk about study, the go-to place is information reading, right? But how do you read? How do you even start that process? But before I go even further with just the two of you guys that are here, I just want to find out from you, when we say research, what comes to your mind? Because I know we have all heard of this word, but I just want to find out from you, and it doesn't have to be academic, it's research in any space. When you hear the word research, what words or what ideas come to your mind? Prince, when we talk about and he is gone, All right, so I'm left with Zoom user. I'm not too sure what your name is, but um, when you hear the word research, what comes to your mind? What are we talking about? What comes to mind? Mm. I'm assuming that you are also experiencing network challenges, but it's not a train smash. So, broadly speaking, when we talk about research, we are usually referring to how we collect information. So, have you done your research? We always say that phrase, or and what we mean by that is, have you done a bit of digging around, trying to find out more about that particular subject or that particular thing? Even as pastors, when you are preparing for your sermon, you also have to uh, do some research. And what we're going to be looking at today is how can we effectively look for that research? How can we look for that material? All right. Hello, Raven. Did I get it correctly? All right. Awesome. Thank you for joining us. So we are looking at research today. So that's what we are looking at. So we are now going into what research is all about. So basically, as I was saying, the moment we talk about research, we are almost always referring to the collection of data. But in actual fact, to talk about research goes beyond the mere collection of data. Because even if we say in whatever space we're in, my guy, have you done the research? So you want to sell ice? Have you done your research? What we are implying is more than just saying, have you looked for information about how ice is made or where you can sell the ice? So we are doing more than data collection. We are also doing data analysis, because what then do you do with the information that you have accumulated? You need to analyze it so that it makes sense to you. All right, because in the absence of that information making any kind of sense, then there's no point to collecting it. So we don't just collect information for the purposes of just merely collecting information. If you go to page 76 of your raw guide, this is where the diagram is that I am talking about. And it's an information pyramid. And it has right at the very bottom data. And we also then have information as being a little bit above. Then we have knowledge, and then we have wisdom. All right. So what we are going to be looking at, or rather, when we talk about research, we are talking about the activities that are taking place within the entire structure of the pyramid. So we have data, which is raw data, and that occupies the bottommost step within the pyramid, and data is usually considered as raw data. Information has been analyzed, and so the analysis process converts the raw data or data into information. And so this pyramid here is something that you would have looked at when you were going through the raw guide for session 2. So this is where you would find it. So the point that I'm trying to make is that when we consider data, or when we consider research rather, we are not just looking at data collection, which is the accumulation, the sourcing, the finding of data or data, but it is also the analysis of that data and trying to figure out how that data can inform the way that we do certain things. All right. So having said that, let us now look at the steps within research. So there are basically 5 steps whenever you are conducting your research. And the first step focuses on the questions. All right. So this is when you are asking a question or you have a puzzle. There is something that is happening and you just don't quite understand what exactly is happening. So in the very first step, the thing that you need to do is to ask the question, which is, what is going on? But it's more than just asking the question, what is going on? It also has to do with asking or finding the right question to ask. So you need to know which question to ask. So questions, they form the very first level here. So, or the very first stage. So the researcher starts out with the question. He desires an answer to the question, and so he plans to use methods to discover the answer. So if the question that you have is, who was James in the Bible? Now, I've phrased the question this way because I want you to understand something. Because we don't just ask questions, but what we do is we need to find answers of the questions that we have asked. And so we then need to understand that when we talk about the second stage, which is method, by method, we are saying, how are you going to find out the answers to the question that you have asked? So to talk about methods is to talk about the process of answering the question. Now, given that our example question is, who is James in the Bible? The most obvious method would be, let's open the Bible and find out. But having said that, there's also another step that is always sort of forgotten about, but I'm going to call it out because I want you guys to be aware of this. And that is, there is always a direct link between the question you ask and the method that you use to answer that question. Now, given the fact that we said, who is James in the Bible? Then it obviously makes sense that we need to go to the Bible in order for us to figure out or find out who James is. So what has happened between those two steps is something that is quite profound, that we always need to have at the back of our minds. When we ask the question, the way the question has been asked, or put differently, the nature of the question is going to determine methods that are used. So another word that you will find being used synonymously with method is methodology. Don't be scared by this word. This word literally is the same as method. It is describing the actual process of collecting data. I'll give you another example. If you were looking at service delivery in Sasolburg, the question would be, what affects service delivery in Sasolburg? Well, how are we going to answer that question? Well, firstly, we need to know about Sasolburg. Where is it? Who lives there? Who is providing services there? What exactly is the nature of the service that is being delivered? All right. And so the way we ask our question automatically informs the way we need to answer that question. And the way we need to answer that question speaks to the methods that we use. But after we have used these methods, the final thing that we get are the results. So we have asked the question, who is James? We've gone to the Bible, and we actually then see, because the first thing that we see is, wow, James wrote a book or books in the Bible. And James is also referenced multiple times. In fact, it seems as if Jesus had a brother named James. All right, so all of this is information that we have, or data rather, that we have collected from the Bible or from the sources that we were looking up our information. So the results are at first raw results, because it's just raw data or raw data. And it is just words, measurements, numbers, sounds, or pictures, and these need to be interpreted. So we have found out that there are all of these individuals called James that exist within the Bible. And the question that we need to ask ourselves is, so what? What exactly does all of this mean? Why is this information necessary? Or at least, what is it telling us? So, looking at the nature of service delivery, say, for example, you go to Sasolburg, and if you speak to the counselors, they might say, everything is okay. But when you speak to the residents, they might say, no, there is no service delivery to talk of, because these guys are not doing A, B, C, D, E. So that is what the residents are saying. That is what the municipality is saying. This is what the main political parties are saying. This is what civil society is saying. Now, we are seeing all of these results. And the question we need to ask ourselves at that stage is, what does it mean? What does all of this information mean? What can it tell us? What are the implications? And so from that, point, we now get into the interpretation of that data to try and turn that data into information. So the interpretation involves carefully thinking about the results, comparing them to each other and to other information, and evaluating their accuracy and validity. Now, those last two concepts, the accuracy and validity. So we are going to look at these concepts more closely, but the idea is, if I've spoken to the DA, if I've spoken to the EFF, if I've spoken to ANC, if I've spoken to concerned residents, if I've spoken to actual individuals who are just residents of Sasolburg, and if I've spoken to the local governance individuals, I have 6 different responses. How do I make all of these responses make sense? So the question you're asking yourself is, how can I make sense of this? Where do I go? Given the fact that I've asked 6 people and 4 people are saying one thing and the other 2 are saying the other, or maybe all 6 are giving you 6 different responses. So how can I know that the questions that I have asked, or rather the results that I have, are accurate? So there are ways of doing that, and we are going to look at it, but not just how accurate information that I'm getting, but how valid is it? So there is accuracy and there is validity. And these concepts might be used synonymously, or they might be used hand in glove with each other to almost imply that they mean one and the same thing, but they mean 2 completely different things, because you can have information that is accurate but not valid. For example, Walter is an educator at Mukanyu, right? That is extremely accurate information, but it's not valid to the question that we are asking. So what we need to understand is, the moment we talk about accuracy, we are talking about how, right? Every time I'm going to give you a big word, I'm going to, do this. And then it's coming, but then we'll translate it into English. So the idea is, every time we talk about accuracy, we need to understand that information is only considered accurate if it is consistent with the things that are actually happening on the ground. So is it an accurate assessment to say there is a bookshelf behind me if there is the information that I've given you is accurate? So accuracy speaks to the authenticity of information. Authenticity is just a big word that implies, or that means, true. Is it true, right? To say that 1 + 1 is 2. Is it true? If it is, then it is. If it isn't, then it isn't. But the moment we talk about validity, we are now talking about value. And I understand that it might sound as if, wait, Walter, but we didn't say value, we said validity. Why am I using the word value? Value is a term that determines the worth of something. So how valuable is this information? Yes, it might be true that Jacob Zuma was once the president of South Africa, but in the grand scheme of things, is it really valuable for us to know that in trying to answer the question around service delivery in Sasolburg? So this is where accuracy and validity need to be understood, that while they might seem to be the same, they are actually completely different terms. So we ask the question again, when we are doing the interpretation of our data, or when we are engaged in the process of transforming the data or the data into information, one of the things that we need to grapple with, or one of the things that we need to contend with, or one of the things that we need to work with is how accurate is the information we have, right? We understand that it is accurate, but now how valid is it? So validity, remember we said, relates to value. And value is always pegged against something else. So for instance, if we are trying to determine the validity of particular results, we ask the question, how well do these results help us to make sense to the questions that we have answered? So the validity of the information that has been interpreted is going to be judged against the questions. So our question, what we wanted to find out about, how well does this information help us to answer that question? So that's where the whole notion of accuracy and validity come through. But after we have gone through that process, the last thing that we are looking at are the conclusions. And this is where the interpreted results need to be considered in relation to the original question, so that conclusions can be made with their corresponding implications and recommendations. Now, there are two things to consider here. The first is, you're going to see that there's a statement that is similar to the one that I gave you at part 4, which is, if we are to determine the validity of information, we need to measure that information against the questions that we have asked. And if we go to conclusions, we are also reading that the interpreted results need to be considered in relation to the original question. Now, it might come off as if this is repetition, but it isn't, precisely because at every stage of the research process, you constantly need to be asking yourself the question, how best are the methods? How best are the results? How best is the interpretation? How best are these conclusions congruent with the questions that we asked? Because if you're asking about how pap is made, and in your final conclusions, you are now talking about the rate of inflation and how, I don't know, pap is made, these are now two completely different things. So at every single stage, you need to understand that there is a centrality to the questions that you are asking. And what that tells us is that asking the right question is itself a skill, because you can't expect to find the right answers when you have asked the wrong questions. You are always going to get the question, you're always going to get the answers for the questions that you have asked. So when we are at step 1 and we are coming up with our research questions, which are the questions that are going to determine the trajectory of our research, or put in English, our questions drive how we are going to find out information. So in order for us to have a good direction to go, we need to ask the right questions. And later on, and by later, not later on in this particular section, but later on, we are going to do a whole section that focuses on asking the right questions. And for those that might want to already start looking at that, we're going to be focusing on what is known as Socratic questioning. Socratic questioning is just a fancy term that is coming from Socrates. And Socrates was a Greek philosopher from way back when, who determined that, you can't just randomly ask questions. There has to be logic behind how you ask those questions. There has to be some form of sequence. There has to be, right, some form of intelligibility behind the way you ask your questions. Because if you fail to ask the right questions, given that we said your questions inform your methods, if you fail to ask the right questions, you're going to end up with the wrong methods. And if you have the wrong methods, you are automatically going to get the wrong results. And there is no way for you to have, because remember we said the results are raw data. There's no way for you to have bad ingredients and imagine you're going to build a very beautiful cake out of it. You can't. So with bad results, we have bad interpretations that are going to lead to bad conclusions. And if we get bad conclusions, we are therefore unable to make the necessary recommendations. I'm going to give you an example. My little sister, who, when she was working for a particular research organization at Wits University, they were going to Soweto to collect data on breastfeeding mothers. And the one disturbing thing that she found out was that researchers did not want to go to every single house. So they would just find a nice spot somewhere, sit under the shade, and they would cook up data and write it there. And so my sister would always ask, how is it that you guys are able to go through all of these houses? And these people started laughing and saying, no, we don't do that. We never do that. Because these were not researchers that she had found herself, but these were researchers that were used by that particular organization. And the organization didn't know that this is what these guys were doing. And so my little sister said, I set these ladies down and I explained to them the reason why we need accurate and valid responses to the questions that we have asked, precisely because when we have concluded our research, we are then going to inform policymakers and say, the 350 rand that you are giving mothers is insufficient, and we have this information to back it up. And if your methods of collecting the data are compromised, you are actually going to compromise everything else that is there further downstream, precisely because you will never be able to come up with the kinds of conclusions and recommendations that are necessary for policymakers to effect a difference in the lives of people. So we need to understand that the research process itself is something that needs to be treated with integrity. But these are concepts that we're going to see. So what we've successfully done in this portion here is to go through the 5 stages, but the 5 stages don't just end with conclusions and recommendations on what to do next. But those conclusions and recommendations might also begin to generate more questions, which is what will take us back to the first part once again. Because now we are asking the question, okay, so we've gone through this, we've found out this, but then why is that also happening? And so from our conclusions, we move back to questions, to methods, to results, to interpretation, and back to more conclusions. And so rather than looking at the research process as a process that starts at 1 with questions and ends at the conclusion, we need to understand that it is actually a cycle. So it is a research cycle, and we move from the conclusions back into more questions, because remember, the more we realize, well, the more we know, the more we realize that we don't know. So from the conclusions that we would have made, we would have established that, oh my goodness, now we know something, but because we now know something, there are other things that we don't know about. And so the cycle starts up again. So this is our research process, or what I am calling the research cycle. Now, research is a skill. And because it is a skill, it has attributes to it. There are certain things that are valuable, things that we need to do, or things that we need to consider. And there are also things that are generally just important to note. The first of these things is objectivity. Now, the word itself is a very loaded word. And just so you know, when we are going to be looking at theology, in fact, when we're going to be looking at worldview, I'm going to be teaching worldview next term. We are going to have a much longer engagement with this word. In fact, with a couple of words that are here. So objectivity, in fact, all of these words, we are going to revisit them again when we look at worldview, because they are certainly part of it. But within the context of research, I'm just going to give you a snippet of what we are trying to talk about. Now, the moment we talk about objectivity, so I'm going to break down the word. Objectivity, it's clear as day that it is coming from the root word object, rather, not objective. It's coming from the root word object. Now, when we say object, we are literally talking about things, right? A pen, a bottle, a plug extension, headphones. These things are objects. But how does that relate to objectivity? Now, this is how it happens. To talk about an object is to talk about the physicality of a thing, but not just the physicality, but we are looking at the attributes of this object. Now, when we look at this object, right, there is no denying the fact that it is black and that these are headphones. This is what it is. This here is a pen. This object is a pen. Now, when we talk about objectivity, objectivity becomes a way of focusing on the tangible aspects of the things that we are focusing on. So if you're asked to be objective, we are saying you state how something is and nothing else. The concept objectivity is always contrasted with subjectivity. Now, objects are these things, all right? So this here is an object. This here, this is an object. So objects are things. Subjects from subjectivity. Subjects are people. Now, when we talk about subjectivity, or when we talk about something as being subjective, we are saying our reference point is the subject itself. And remember, we said subjects are people. So when you conduct subjective research, this is where you are conducting the kind of research that places people at its core in ways where you want to find out about their feelings, about their perceptions, about their thoughts. So what do you think about this course? If we ask this question in the full entire class, we are going to get 10 different responses, literally because we have 10 people in the class. But why are those responses different? They are different precisely because we have asked a subjective question, a question that places at its center the experience of the subject or the experience of the individual, the experience of the person. And so when we, for example, you put in 3 scoops of sugar into a cup of tea, you stir that tea, you have 3 people who are there, tell them to taste the tea and ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how sweet do you think this tea is? The responses that you're going to get are going to vary. They're going to be different because you've asked a subjective question. And so the subjects are going to give you responses based on their own personal experience. But when it comes to objectivity, we are saying we are placing at the center the object itself. And so the object is what is going to help inform us about what it's like. So in simple terms, when we talk about objective research, we are talking about the kind of research that yields information that is unbiased, information that is not tainted by or contaminated or that is messed up by the interpretations of people. If I was to ask you how many books are on the top shelf, regardless of who you are, what you have experienced, whether you come from a house with both parents present, whether or not you went to a Model C school, or whether or not you were born prior to independence or post-independence, you are just going to count the number of books and come up with the same response. Why? Because the books, the objects, are the ones that we have placed at the center of the question. And so the method that we use is objective. So objectivity, this implies that your mind must be open and unbiased when you do research. If you earnestly want a certain answer, you are likely to push the evidence in that direction. So some archaeologists have found that non-existent missing link because they so eagerly wanted to prove their evolutionary theory. So what exactly are we saying? What we're saying is, in terms of the way you conduct your research, you need to conduct it in such a way that it is unbiased. It is not tainted by people's feelings. Or most importantly, because we, the researchers, are the ones that are asking the questions, we then need to make sure that the responses that we are getting are not contaminated by the way that we have asked our questions. So we go for objectivity rather than subjectivity. But that also depends on the nature of the research that you're doing, because there are also the kind of researches where you need to find out about people's experiences, and that is subjective because we are talking about the experiences of the subject. All right. Precision. Now, when it comes to precision, I mean, we have already said a little bit about this when we were talking about validity and accuracy. Precision means that we don't guess or estimate, we actually measure so that we can get an accurate reading. We don't round up to the nearest 10, for example, by saying, how long is the ruler, and maybe the ruler is 14.5 centimeters. We don't say it is 10 centimeters because we've rounded to the nearest 10. We need something that is actually precise. And the precision of our measurements are themselves going to determine the validity of our results. And the validity of our results will ultimately determine the usefulness or the value of the recommendations and conclusions that can be drawn from such data. So we need precision. But in as much as we need precision, how can we know that what we are measuring is actually correct? So verification becomes a very central element of the entire research cycle. So you can't just ask one person and think you have the whole story. For guys that happen to be lawyers or friends of lawyers, or maybe if you're like me, you have watched Suits, you will immediately know that there is more than one side to any story. And so we constantly need to verify. And the way that we verify, the word is not there, but the word that I'm going to use, yes, we all know what that means, is triangulation. Triangulation is a fancy way of saying you can't get to the truth by speaking to one person. You need to speak to a minimum of 3 people. So triangulation, from triangle, all right, where we have this side, and that side there, so the base and 2 sides. So in order for us to have a triangle, we have 3 points of contact, all right? And so we need to at least speak to 3 people in order for us to figure out whether the thing that is being spoken about is true or not. So triangulation is one of the methods of verification. But the other, which is also almost just like triangulation, you need to look at different sources. which is literally saying the same thing. So you can't just grab one book and then believe that, I have all the information that I could ever need. No, because if you look at one book, the only thing that you know is from the perspective of the person that wrote the book. But there are other people who are out there who have written other things. So we need to constantly verify. All right. And then point number 4 there, preferring the simplest explanation. Once again, I'm giving you I hope I'm not bombarding you with too many things for you to go look up. So there's what is known as Occam's razor. Occam's razor is, I would call it words of wisdom by a Greek philosopher called Occam, who said, in fact, I'm just going to tell you the very simplest way of his ideas were put. And that is, there is no need for you to inflate. To inflate is to infuse way too many things. There is no reason to inflate an explanation where the simplest is true. The idea there being, the moment things get too complicated, too complex, chances are someone is trying to hide the truth. So more often than not, the simplest explanation is the truth. And we all know that this is a principle, and because it's a principle, it is the best rule of thumb that you can use, but not to say that it is definitively the truth, because there are instances where the truth is stranger than fiction because the truth is way more complex. So it's almost like looking at, and I hate using, all right, so for example, yes, no, this might be a better example. What is happening in Palestine and Gaza. We might say it's because, the Israelites are being bad people. They are trying to occupy these other people's land. That's a simplistic explanation. And we can't even say, yeah, no, what is happening to the people of Gaza is because of what they did on, was it October 17 last year? So this is just purely retaliation. No, that is a simplistic explanation. We need to understand that there is a distinction between a simple explanation and a simplistic explanation. So these two terms, yes, they sound like they are the same thing, but they are different. A simple explanation is an explanation that articulates things the way they are, as simply as we can, but a simplistic explanation is one that, as a matter of principle, tends to oversimplify to the point of omitting certain other information that is quite central to our understanding of what is happening. So what we are always looking for is the simplest explanation, but not a simplistic explanation. So a simple explanation might give you all of the complex and technical jargon, but a simplistic one overlooks all of the necessary things and reduces everything to something that becomes quite difficult to understand. And as you can see, there is always the preference to empirical data. So empirical literally just means things that we can count. things that we can observe, things that we can touch, things that we can feel, things that we can hear. In fact, one way of putting it is empirical data is always trying to find the right word. So empirical data is always gathered by our senses. So we can see that this headset is black. This is empirical data because we can look at it and we can see the color. We can also see that this is one pair of headsets, right? They are called a pair because there's that side and there's that side. So they call it a pair and it's one pair like this. How do we know this? Because we can count it. We can feel that there is a hard plastic casing here, and there's a softer rubber over there, and we have these cushions over here. How do we know that? Because we can feel it. So all the information that can generally be considered trustworthy is information that we gather through our senses. If I can feel that this is a wooden table, I can trust that it is a wooden table. So empirical, through observation, experiment, or experience, data is real and measurable. So empirical data is real and measurable. Things that we can measure, things that we can test or taste, things that we can count, things that we can see. All right. And then logical reasoning. We also definitely need logical reasoning as a way of analyzing or interpreting our data. And we need to analyze our data in a very logical manner, precisely because our conclusions and recommendations depend on it. So we need to invoke the faculties of reason and logic. And it might sound counterintuitive now, because when we are going to be looking at worldview, we are also going to, and when we look at theology, we are going to look at the noetic impact of sin, which is a fancy way of saying our intellect was destroyed by sin, and therefore we cannot think clearly because we are subject to sin. Because we are sinners, everything about us was corrupted by original sin, and that includes our reasoning. So when we get to worldview and when we get to theology, these are some of the things that we are going to be talking about. But yet here under research, we're saying, yeah, we need to use our reason, regardless of the fact that it might be corrupted, but we still need to use our faculties of reason. And our faculties of reason are themselves informed by this concept that we will also talk about when it comes to worldview, skepticism. So we need to be skeptical. Skeptical is a fancy way of saying doubt. So one way of putting it is doubting Thomas was a skeptic. What does it mean? It means don't just believe something because someone said it to be true. So just because someone says something does not imply that what they're saying is true, which is also the reason why verification of information through triangulation is necessary. Why? Because if one person said it, how can we know it's true? All right. And just because this person said it doesn't make it to be true either. I remember there's a movie that I watched. It's called Pirates of the Caribbean, and the main actor Captain Jack Sparrow, he always used to say, you can always trust a dishonest person to be dishonest, but it's the honest ones that you have to look out for. Why? Because you never know when they are lying to you, because we are so used to believing them at face value, we don't even have to check if what they are saying is true or not. But if it's with a dishonest person, you best believe that they are going to try to deceive you and lie to you. And so that's why you can trust a dishonest person to be dishonest, but an honest one, that's where the problem is. But what skepticism is saying is, don't just blindly take what people say. Doubt, ask questions, take the thing, find out, is it really as robust, as sturdy, as solid as it is being presented to be? So being skeptical becomes a very important element within the whole research cycle, precisely because this helps us to get a deeper appreciation of the validity of the information that we are working with. So it's also kind of, right, I'm giving you another one, counterintuitive to say, I get to the truth by doubting the truth. But that, in essence, is what skepticism is all about. We need to doubt our way to the right answer. And our ability to doubt our way to the right answer is largely informed by our ability to ask the most important logical questions. And these are questions that we are asking not just at the start of our process, but within the verification and within the interpretation step. Ask the right questions. How valid is this? When did this happen? Who saw this? All right? Who else was there? What have other people said about this particular thing? So you can't go to a single book and believe that what it is saying is true. You need to open a number of books, which is the reason why we're saying for your assignments, you need to use a minimum of 5 texts. We call them texts because they can either be books or articles. And within books, there are also multiple types of books, also multiple types of articles, because we can have both digital as well as those in print, etc., etc. But ultimately, we need to be able to ask the right questions in order to test whether what we are getting is indeed the right kind of answer. All right. Now, in terms of the methodology, because remember, we said methodology or methods are literally looking at the steps that we are using to come up with the answers for the questions that we have asked. And we said, whenever you ask a question, you are also inadvertently determining how you are going to answer that question. So your questions inform your method. Now we have literary research. Literary research, this is, in other circles, we call it a literature review. This is where you go to the library and you open books. This is where you go onto the internet and you find academic, peer-reviewed articles that you are using to, gather your information, to gather your data. All right. So this is where you go and look through literature that has been written. Then field research, remember when I gave you the question, the hypothetical question, service delivery in Sasolburg. Another way of getting that information is actually going to Sasolburg and, talking to the people, experiencing what they're experiencing, and, you speak to the people concerned. That we call field research because you're entering the field, which is Sasolburg, to actually look for information. All right. And while you are there conducting your field research, there are also other types of research that fall under field research that you can do. So you can do surveys, you can do what is called ethnography. Ethnography is just a fancy way of saying, go live with the people and experience yourself what they themselves are experiencing. So you go there and almost like saying you're talking to your friend who's in the UK and you're saying, goodness, we have so much load shedding here in South Africa. And they're like, what exactly is load shedding? What is it like? And, what does it do? How does it affect the way that you do things? Now, you can either tell that person what all of this is, or they come here, they live with you for a week, a month, or a year, and experience the load shedding themselves. So that is considered as ethnography, where you are actually in the field. And there are also other branches while we are there under field research, which is emic or ethic studies. Now, emic and ethic studies, it sounds like a strange language. It probably is. But these are just fancy Latin terms, if I'm not mistaken, for are you going to be observing what is happening out there, or are you going to be within the experience? What does it mean? That friend of yours who is in the UK and is asking you about your experiences of load shedding, the kind of research they are doing is called ETIC, ETIC, ethic research, meaning that they are asking questions about something that is out there. So as you are the researcher, you are standing on the outside looking in. So as they are on a call with you in the UK while you are here in South Africa and they're asking you what is happening in South Africa, for them, they are taking an ethic stance where they stand outside of South Africa and ask you what's happening there. Or you can do an emic study. Emic, EMIC, literally implies inside. So this is where they fly over from the UK to South Africa, and now they're experiencing it. So they are no longer an outsider who's looking in, but they are now within. So they are now in an emic position. And there are also two kinds of research that you can do. You can either do a qualitative research. Now, a qualitative research, this is the kind of research that focuses predominantly on the subject and the subject's experiences. So, for example, that friend of yours asking you, so what are your experiences of load shedding? That question is a subjective question that implies you are doing a qualitative study. So we can take qualitative from the word quality, all right? So the quality of a thing and the quantity of a thing are two completely different issues. When we focus on the quality of a thing, we are focusing on something that is, remember, imbued with values or imbued with a value system. The word imbue literally means exposed to. All right. So something that has been exposed to a value system. All right. Remember when we spoke about validity and accuracy, and when we said the validity of something is determined by its value relative to the question that we have asked. So how well can this particular thing help us to understand the question that we have asked? Value. So when it also comes to qualitative, or the quality of something, we are talking about the value aspect of it. And we need to know that value can never be quantified. So for example, when we say the same cup of tea, we give it to 10 people, we say on a scale of 1 to 10, tell us what it is. The answer is we actually don't know, because this is a qualitative research. Because with qualitative research, you can't ever know something as it is. You can always know it from the perspective of the person that experiences it. So for example, right now, we might say, talk about the weather. It might be 28 degrees outside, but you'll find someone else wearing a jersey in the same 28-degree heat. Why? Because their experience of the weather is determined by who they are. And all forms of research that are aimed at trying to figure out people's experiences, that is qualitative research. Or put differently, that is subjective research. So we might say objectively it's 28 degrees, but this person will tell you, my goodness, it is so cold. Coincidentally, when I went on honeymoon with my wife, we went to Zanzibar, and when we were there, we were told, you guys are very lucky, because if you had arrived a week earlier than you did, it was so cold, it was completely unbearable. It was so unbearable to the extent that people were buying thick jackets, and they were buying, what do you call them, electric blankets, and people bought heaters, and because they were saying it was so cold. And we're like, what exactly was the temperature? How cold did it get? And we're like, it was 22 degrees. So if, for those that know, you'll understand, because in Zanzibar, on a regular Tuesday, temperatures are always above 34, 35 degrees Celsius. And this is what these guys are used to. So the entire time that we were there, the coldest that it got was 28 degrees. And so these guys were like, no, temperatures got to 22 and we got mad with cold. We didn't know what to do, because they are so used to the heat. So when you are talking to Zanzibaris about the weather, they are going to give you their own experience of it. And so that is qualitative research. However, we also have quantitative research, from the word quantity, where we want to quantify certain things. And we can ask for the number of things. For example, how many teaspoons do we have? How old are you? What exactly is the temperature on a day-to-day basis or at any given moment? All of these are examples of quantitative questions. And what we need to understand is when dealing with quantitative research, we need to have asked the kinds of questions that will inform quantitative research. So there are certain ways of asking certain things that are going to determine the nature of the research that you're going to do. So, for example, what is your take on Mukanyu so far? What has been your experience? There's nothing quantitative about that. It's qualitative research. However, there are also instances where a person is asked a very subjective question, which would require them to quantify something. So, for example, how hot do you think it feels? We are not asking what exactly is the temperature on the thermometer, but how hot do you think it is? While you are giving us a number, that's not quantitative research. It is still considered qualitative. Why is it qualitative when the response is a number? Because the nature of the question is the one that determines whether it is quantitative or qualitative. So it is not necessarily the answer itself. Because, for example, we have, broadly speaking, it can range from a 5 to a 7-point scale of a person's feelings about something. So, and it can range from strongly agree, neutral, strongly disagree, or strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. Now, while the response is there, I agree or I disagree or I strongly or I don't, and so on and so forth, you might think it's qualitative because the response is words, but how the question has been asked and where you are answering the question is the thing that will determine whether it is qualitative or quantitative. Because in this instance, this is a quantitative research. Why is it considered quantitative when the responses that are there are qualitative? Well, precisely because we are then able to say that 20% of the students at Mukanyu feel that it is a complete waste of money. Or 80% of them say this is the best institution that we have ever experienced. So what am I saying? Regarding qualitative and quantitative research, we are saying it is not so much the responses themselves that determine whether this is quantitative or qualitative, but the nature of the questions or how we ask our questions will determine whether the kind of research that needs to be done is bean counting or whether we are looking at people's perceptions and feelings. All right. Are we clear? So I only have Prince, so you have all my undivided attention. Is what I'm saying making sense to you? Prince, can you hear me? All right, we have been experiencing network challenges, so I completely understand if he might not be hearing me. All right, but in any case, this is what we, so if you go through the raw guide, this, all right, so let me also address this issue. So let me actually share my screen so that you're able to see this error that exists. So if you go to lecture 3, research for my theological studies, you're going to see that it is saying for this section, please refer to the raw guide, part 4.1 to 4.3, and then 4.6. And yet, this is an error. So it is not part 4, it is actually part 3. So when you get to the raw guide, you need to look up part 3, because this is where the theological research is found. So it's part 3. So 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, and 3.6. So 3.6, these are interviews. So in terms of, so the last thing that we spoke about was the quantitative and qualitative. So you need to understand that there are methods and there are tools. What do I mean? We have research methods. Within research methods, we have either qualitative or quantitative research. And then in terms of the tools, we are saying within the context of quantitative methodologies, what tools can I use to ask my questions? Or at least to get answers for my questions. Now, you can use, for qualitative purposes, you can use interviews. So interviews are used predominantly for qualitative research, and the kinds of interviews is also predominantly the open-ended kind. Now, open-ended interviews are the kind of interviews where, well, they are contrasted with structured interviews. A structured interview is when I'm going to ask you this question, followed by that question, followed by that question. With open-ended interviews, this is when the direction of the questions is determined by what comes up in the answer. So it becomes open-ended. So we also have structured and semi-structured interviews. We also have focus group discussions. We have surveys. And so all of these are ways by which we gather information. So we are saying for quantitative research, we can use tools such as closed-ended, in fact, a questionnaire, because we need to understand that there's a distinction between a questionnaire and an interview. A questionnaire is usually administered, and I say usually, exactly usually, as a form, digital or print like this, that has a series of questions, and you mail it to someone or give it to someone and they complete the questions. They're either ticking multiple choice answers or answering yes, no questions. Or you can literally be asking the person the question and you fill out the form. So that is a questionnaire, which is a tool that is used for quantitative. For qualitative, we're talking about open-ended interviews where you ask a person a question and they just go. So they are not restricted in the kinds of responses that they give you. But that means you need to be the one in control. You need to be able to identify whether or not you have drifted off topic. All right. So these are the tools that often come with the different methodologies. All right. So I know that Prince is having a bit of connection issues there, not a train smash. Thank you very, very much for joining us for this session. And I will see you again on Saturday, but please remember that tomorrow you are having your session from 6 to 8 on Christian character. And then you're also going to have on Wednesday biblical interpretation. All right. Have yourselves a very wonderful evening and enjoy. If you do have any questions concerning anything that we have discussed in this session, please do not hesitate to ask those questions on Saturday, and we'll be able to go over anything that you would consider a gray area. All right. Thank you very much, guys. Have yourselves a very wonderful evening. Good night.